Well, it's summer, and summer always reminds me of Street Fighter. I talked a number of years ago about how I first discovered Street Fighter 2, the original Street Fighter 2 arcade cabinet. It was actually at a public pool tucked away in a little shed in the corner, and during Adult Swim, we would all used to sort of swarm that cabinet. And being a little bit younger than the average player, it was hard for me to get on the system and really learn the moves, but I was enthralled by Street Fighter nonetheless. And one of the interesting things, especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, is that you wanted that arcade experience at home, and a lot of times you had to suffer through some pretty bad ports of your favorite arcade games. So what I'm going to do today is a look at a couple of the obscure Street Fighter ports, not just of Street Fighter 2, but throughout the whole kind of history of the franchise. Ports that I've run into. Of course, Street Fighter has been ported to all manner of consoles. And I'm going to start actually with my first Street Fighter 2 port, and that is the Tiger Electronics Street Fighter 2 handheld, which you can see here in a nice, I guess, emulation or kind of close-up of the game. You know, these Tiger Electronic devices were in a lot of cases, especially if you didn't have a Game Boy, one of the few opportunities you had to take the arcade with you. And as crummy as this looks, and believe me, this was, a terrible game, I had the background, the M. Bison stage background. You had the characters, the little, whatever you want to call it, LCD sprites would replicate some of the moves. And if you were in a car, and you were in that car for 3 hours on summer vacation, and you knew no better, this was a reasonable clone of Street Fighter until you can actually get to the arcade. So I remember actually playing this on my way down to the shore, as we call it, with my parents. And so, I knew I was going to play the real thing at the beach, but until I could get into those arcades, this is what I had. And possibly the worst port, I don't even think you can call it a port, but the worst handheld Street Fighter of all time. Now I'm going to go in order of discovery for me personally, and the next port that I was able to get my hands on was the MS-DOS port of Street Fighter 2, which I think came out in the early 90s, and I actually had a computer that could play this, which is kind of a big deal. We'd just gotten a new computer, and I had researched the specs and discovered that, wow, I could play Street Fighter 2 on the PC, and because the PC was so inherently powerful, surely this would be exactly like the arcade. Well, I was bitterly disappointed, I would have to say, although I don't know if that's fair. Maybe I wasn't bitterly disappointed, but I was perturbed that it really wasn't keeping up with the arcade machine, because I had this idea in my head that, oh, a new computer, it must be as powerful as the arcade. And it really wasn't. This was a port that, if I remember correctly, was a little slow. It felt sluggish. It didn't have that pinpoint accuracy of control that the cabinet had. And I recall the music being a little off. But at the end of the day, the idea was to get close to the arcade. The port had to at least fool you into imagining that you could have the arcade experience at home. And if you look at these graphics, yeah, this was close. So, because this was not my PC, this was the family PC, because I didn't have unlimited access to it, I really didn't get a chance to play this game as much as possible. My father had a home business, and really that was his computer, and I got to use it on the weekends, but for all of its problems, it was Street Fighter at home, and it gave me a little taste of what home Street Fighter could offer, especially because if you follow the channel, you'll know this, I was not allowed to have a Super Nintendo. So I couldn't have what at that time was the definitive version, so I had to settle for this rather underwhelming port of what at that time was my favorite arcade game. And the next obscure port is the 3DO Super Street Fighter, and yeah, I don't know if it's totally obscure. I mean, we've all heard about this. I think the YouTube personalities have done a decent job covering it, but certainly at that time in the early to mid-90s when this came out, I want to say it was maybe 94, 95, for the 3DO, This was as good as it got, and it was kind of elusive because who could afford a 3DO? You know, not many people were paying the $600 or $700 that console was asking for at the time. So I remember playing this. They had it set up in an EB Games in the mall, and then, pretty surprisingly, my next door neighbor got this system, and it was interesting because, you know, he wasn't really into video games, didn't have a ton of stuff. You know, I don't think, you know, the family was that well off financially, but someone, an uncle or something, gave this to him, and he had Super Street Fighter 2, so I put a fair bit of time into the game at his house, and I remember this being really, really good. Now, I have not played it since then, but to me, you know, the graphics, the sound, the controls were very good. I don't believe the 3DO had a 6-button controller, and I think you had to, like, daisy-chain the controllers together, if I remember, so that was, you know, a little annoying. But fundamentally, I thought this was a very good game, and again, graphics and sound really, to me, at that point, felt like the arcade. So maybe up to the early 90s, this was the most successful port. And again, if you've played it since, and you have a more updated perspective, you know, let me know below. But I thought this was quite an achievement. Now, what was far from an achievement was the Game Boy version of Street Fighter 2. Hard to believe that they came out with this, but it was a moneymaker, and I remember that a friend of mine got it first, and we had both got the Super Game Boy, so we figured, you know, let's give this a try on the quote-unquote big screen, and of course, we had taken it on vacation again, you know, going down the shore, waiting to get to the real machines, you know, you would play something like this, and while it was certainly better than the Tiger handhelds, still not very good. I want to say this came out maybe 95, 96, around that time, so Street Fighter 2 was certainly not the newest game, and everyone had moved on to Super Street Fighter 2, but again, you wanted to get close to the arcade, you know, you wanted an approximation, and really the Game Boy at that time didn't have a lot of fighters, so just the fact that you could get this onto the Game Boy, I remember it being impressive, but if you go back and you play it now, I mean, it's very clunky, very sloppy, hard to pull off the special moves, and all it is an approximation. It's a graphical nod to the superior game, but in and of itself is pretty poor. So it was pretty surprising that the next outing on the Game Boy, Street Fighter Alpha, was actually pretty good. And, you know, this was one that I had read about, but I certainly wasn't going to go after the Game Boy version when obviously you could play the PlayStation, Super Saturn, obviously. I think the Super Nintendo had Alpha 2, but I tried this a number of years later, and you know what? It's not bad. I think it's actually a decent reimagining of Street Fighter as a handheld game. Controls are crisp, sound is decent, it has a nice simplified control system, so you can actually pull off the moves, and I think it just, you know, it's surprising how much faster this version felt, as opposed to Street Fighter 2. Yeah, it's fairly limited, and you're not going to have a great time with it, but as far as a handheld version goes, it was pretty entertaining, so you know, it's worth a $5 pickup. You know, it's worth hunting down on emulation, if you can even find it these days, just to get a sense of what the Game Boy as a platform was able to do with a genre that was pretty difficult to program for. And I think this is a really nice example of a platform maturing and developers really figuring out a way not to emulate the arcade, but to come up with a way to take that experience, condense it, and make it reasonably fun on a handheld. And lastly, one of my favorite obscure ports of Street Fighter, that is the PC Engine version. Now it has some compromises, especially if you're going to play with the 2-button controller, but by this point there was a 6-button option for the PC Engine. But what surprised me about this was how good of a representation of Street Fighter this was. I mean, I think the sound is better than the Genesis version. Graphics are a little limited, but this really gave you everything you wanted out of a Street Fighter port. And I don't understand why it wasn't released here in the States. I had a TurboGrafx 16. I was dying for good games. And if they had just brought this over, and maybe it was a licensing deal with Capcom, Nintendo, or Capcom and Sega, but even at some point during the TurboGrafx 16's lifespan, if this had come out, I think it could have saved the system. There was a similar story about Mortal Kombat. Somehow, TurboGrafx was pitched Mortal Kombat, and the Japanese office turned it down. I think there was a G4 special about that when they were talking about sort of failed systems back when that channel was worth watching. Anyway, it's a good port. It's worth checking out as a historical curiosity. Not as good as the Super Nintendo, but it holds its own against the SNES and Genesis versions. And again, I can only wonder what would have happened if this very, very solid effort was available to American TurboGrafx 16 owners. So there you have it, some obscure Street Fighter ports. Of course, there are many, many others in Brazil and Europe and on the Japanese personal computers, so let me know what you think are some of the best and most memorable Street Fighter ports. Talk about it down below, and thanks for watching Game Escape.